Welcome to our group's presentation of generating test cases. This presentation was created by Wellesley Shumay, Nick Herbert, and Paul Mason. Test cases can be a powerful tool in performing different checks on software to make sure it is functioning properly. Test cases can be performed on different portions of the software. One fundamental approach to verification on these portions is experimenting with the behavior of a product to see whether the product performs as expected. These tests can be performed on different levels of the software, and if they all come out of the test performing the way that you expect the software to perform, you have a positive test case that shows you that that software is performing the way you planned on it performing. It is common practice to input a few sample cases, test cases, which are usually randomly generated and empirically selected, and then verify that the output is correct. This is an example of verifying output in different cases. This is probably the strongest part of test cases, is comparing the output to verify that each output in each case is the output you are expecting. The only testing of any system that can provide absolute certainty about the introduction of correctness of system behavior is exhaustive testing. Testing the system under all possible circumstances. Now, this isn't always possible because when a human is testing a software, it is impossible for them to think of every possible case that this software could be put under. This is why, to provide absolute certainty above the correctness of the system, it should involve exhaustive testing. How are test cases done? Most test cases can be applied to specific portions of the software, as we discussed in the previous slide, but there are different ways and tactics that you can go about performing test cases. One is the systematic and practical approach to testing all cases possible. This is where you would break down your software into categories or groups of different cases that could be performed, and you would create test cases for each of these cases or categories. We observed in our research that in general, the only testing of any system that can provide absolute certainty about the correctness of a system behavior is exhaustive testing. That is why the categorizing of different cases that the software could be put under is very important, to be able to create test cases for each of those categories and any subcategories that may go along with them. Testing the system under all possible circumstances, unfortunately, could never be performed in practice. Thus, we need statistical testing using testing strategies, some criteria for selecting significant test cases. This is where a systematic or practical approach would be useful. Another tool or trick to performing a test case is to create test cases based off of the design specifications. This is when you would go back to your design document after the software is created and look at the specific points in the design specifications that are vital or important, and to create test cases for those specifications to make sure that the software is performing at the way the design specifications stated. The last one is to focus on vital data structures, modules of code, and other objects. This could also go along with the design specifications. As you focus on the important requirements from your requirements document, those are usually the vital data structures and requirements and modules that the software is performing. So to focus on these is a great tip or trick to performing test cases. As you can probably tell, creating test cases is not a specific exercise where you need to live up to specific requirements. There's a vast variety of different strategies and ways to create and perform test cases on your software. On this slide, we will talk about a couple of tips and tricks that most software engineers use to create these test cases and to ensure through those test cases that their software is performing in a way in which is acceptable. The first one we're going to talk about is, when is it enough? When do you know that all the testing you performed is enough and your software has passed all the tests and is ready to be put out into production? We observe that in general, the only testing of any system that can provide absolute certainty about the correctness of a system behavior is exhaustive testing, testing the system under all possible circumstances. As we discussed in the previous slide, this is not possible. So, to ensure that all your tests have been exhaustive enough, you need to make sure that you've tested all of the key and vital sections of your software that to make sure that they're performing in a way that is acceptable for the customer of the software. A really good way to do this is through automated testing. This is probably the best way to create these test cases. Test automation is software that automates any aspect of testing of an application system. So this is an automated way to create these test cases. With the automated way, you eliminate the human error of looking over something that may seem clear, but that is not super clear when you're actually running the software. The last thing that you can do is realize that with test cases, there are limitations. Programming testing can be used to show the presence of bugs, but never to show their absence. That was a quote from Dijkstra, and he clearly states in this quote that testing can be great to show you the presence of bugs, but testing will never show you the absence of bugs. So the key to test cases is to make sure you're covering all your bases as far as vital objects or modules in your software, and test all of your outputs to make sure that any calculations or other information that your software is providing is actually correct.
Test cases can be a logical map for how a programmer can prove to his or her client or boss that a program is working as expected. With its benefits come some downsides that can become very costly if not kept in check. We are now going to review the upsides and downsides of generating test cases in your application. We will also discuss briefly when it is a good idea to use test cases and when it is not a good idea. Let's step into the upsides of generating test cases. The first and foremost benefit for generating test cases is that it creates a logical trail of conformity to the software requirements. A likely scenario is that if your test case proves that 3 points of the software requirements document are successfully implemented, but a fourth was left unimplemented, we would clearly see the gap in coverage. The test cases should be written to show the client or the user that their business requirements were implemented in the agreed upon method. The second upside of test cases is an off-branch of the first. The test cases act as a communication channel between the developer and the client, user, or stakeholder. Let's say you inform the stakeholder that all business requirements were successfully implemented. With any system, the stakeholder will struggle to prove that on their own. The system is likely too big and complex to fully understand it in the implementation stage. This is where having a test case can help guide the stakeholder into the system and show the functionality that they want to verify. The final benefit stems from the third and is crucial to your continued success as a programmer. If the test cases implement the business requirements and the stakeholder can navigate the system to prove that for themselves, then the test cases will work to increase stakeholder or user confidence in the system. User confidence is huge when it comes to believing that the system is capable enough and reliable enough to handle what it should. Now, everything that I mentioned thus far sounds peachy. While there are upsides to test cases, there are equivalent downsides to keep in mind. The first and most obvious is that generating test cases require time and effort. This translates to an investment in financial resources for the company. Test cases are usually written by a developer because they understand the ins and outs of the system better than anyone. But is that really the best use of expensive time for a company? Whether it is or isn't is a different debate, but rest assured that each test case document equates to at least a few $100s at the very minimum. The second downside stems from the expensive nature of generating test cases. In my experience, I've seen that test cases can be incredibly detailed to the point of make sure that this button changes colors when clicked. The question is, was this test case really necessary? Is it contributing to the performance of the application? Or are we just writing test cases so that our boss is pleased once we have a test case document generated? An obvious downside to generating test cases is that everyone has different opinions on what is essential to the performance of the application. So some test case documents might feel bloated, while others might be bare bones. The final downside is that writing test cases require updating those test cases as frequently as code is updated. With more rapid development patterns these days, a test case document could become obsolete very quickly if not updated on each iteration. This can present a huge cost for a business or organization that operates in this fashion. Here's a list of times when it is appropriate to use test cases and when it's not. Specifically, when to use test cases is when the longevity of the test case document being used is long enough to pay the initial expense of generating test case documents. Or, in other words, hopefully you have enough time to write the test cases and use those test cases before the next iteration of the code. Also, in scenarios when a bug would introduce a system failure as opposed to a minor inconvenience for the user. For example, healthcare. Healthcare industry, you don't want to get things wrong there. So a test case would prove very beneficial. But when not to use test cases? Well, when code needs to get to production fast. If you need that code working tomorrow, then you probably don't want to take the time and the effort to generate those test cases. And when bugs in a given situation would not be detrimental to the system, or when budget restrictions are significant. Keeping these in mind, you can determine for yourself when you have a good case for test cases and when you don't have a good case for test cases.
Specific examples of when you want to use test cases are scenarios where bugs would be catastrophic. Other instances where you would want to use test cases are, one, if you have a contract that requires that your software fulfill requirements from the user. Having documented test cases and having it documented that you passed all those test cases will help you show that you fulfilled your contract. Another interesting instance is if your testing team are not as experienced at testing or at your user domain, it will help test cases will help keep them on track and help them try a host of possibilities. Another instance is if you're doing something like a desktop application or an embedded system where you're going to be using that software for a long time and continuously updating it. It's good to have it will be economically worth it to have a bed of test cases that you can draw from again and again and again over the years of updating that software. And another interesting application of test cases is that if you have a niche market that you're giving your software to, it's easier where the users are going to act in predictable ways, it's easier to have a series of test cases to test that for those users. Whereas if you are producing software for the mass market, it might be better to have experienced software testers and more worth your money to have experienced software testers who are more intuitive about trying a whole host of things that you might get from anyone in the mass market. Here are some examples of when not to use test cases. First, if you are creating a mobile app that you want to push quickly and never update again, it might not be worth it to create a bed of test cases. Also, if you're doing agile, which is represented here by sticky notes, where you're doing fast iterations and usually working probably in more of a web-based language, where the software is more malleable and you're updating quickly anyway and taking care of bugs that users find, it might not be effective or work in your system to use rigorous test cases. Another instance is if you have older, more experienced testers, you might find it more cost-effective to rely on their intuition rather than a constricting set of test cases. You don't want to bind an experienced team down with test cases that they have to follow. Overall, you basically want to analyze your situation and see if it is cost-effective to use test cases.